Okay, welcome back to lecture 12 of our course. And in the previous several lectures, we have worked hard to set up a framework to understand dynamics of classical open systems at different scales, at different levels of resolution. One subject that is still missing in this chapter is how to extend this treatment to the quantum level. We will postpone this problem of, so to say, quantum extension of open system theory to the end of the course, when we will understand how many hours we have left and what is the interest of the crowd. And we will use this time that we have now to exploit some of the, so to say, use you can make of all the theoretical frameworks we've been working on. So, to some extent, one of the major advantages of what we have done in the last many lectures was that we are now able to add a time label to configuration space distributions or to phase-space distributions. So essentially, if you were to compare what we have in our hands today with respect to what you had in your hands at the end of a standard, typical course in statistical mechanics, is that we moved from, say, P gamma, the equilibrium phase-space distribution of statistical thermodynamics, to a dynamical phase distribution, which is sampled through the Langevin equation, or the Fokker-Planck equation. So essentially, we are now able to study processes that do not actually remain the same with time. For instance, we can study thermalization processes. Right. Now, at this level, I'd like to emphasize one thing. Once you're ready to think in terms of statistical ensembles, once you realize that you have only a partial knowledge and partial control of the system, and therefore you must take a statistical perspective on mechanics of many particle systems or complex systems, then you understand that equations of motions basically lose their fundamental role. Now, if I'm to study classical mechanics of just a couple of bodies or a single bodies, then really mechanics is all within the solution of Newton's equation. If I'm to study a quantum mechanical problem of a few bodies, mechanics is in the solution of the Schrödinger equation. But let's stick to classical mechanics for a moment. However, if I'm an open system, the classical equations of motion per se will give me information that needs to be marginalized. And by marginalized, it means that I have a redundant information which has no interpretation event by event. Everything that can retain a physical interpretation is the average over many, many of such events. For instance, you have a protein and you have a solvent. Maybe you're interested in the process through which the protein changes conformation, but whatever you simulate by integrating an equation of motion about the specific motion of the solvent is irrelevant because you didn't know the initial position of the protein to begin with, the solvent to begin with. So all I'm trying to say is that the equations of motion in a statistical mechanical in a statistical mechanical setting are basically tools to probe distributions. And the distributions are really what we can hope to be achieving about an open system. So you can think about solving Newton's equations as a way of sampling the Boltzmann distributions, for instance, if your system is in equilibrium. But your physical quantity of interest is not the trajectories that you simulate, which is irrelevant because it's zero measure in a space of trajectories. But rather, the distribution you can still distill out by statistically analyzing many of such trajectories or a very long one. So when we shift the emphasis from the trajectory to the distribution, then of course you want to use distributions to study all the physical processes you're interested in. Well, in third year in your bachelor education in physics, provided you went through that kind of education, you introduced the concept of ensembles to study averages of operators, thermal averages of operators, a given temperature or inverse temperature beta. And they are nothing but gamma exponent beta h of gamma, and then you have your operator, just function of phase space variables, divided by the measure. That's fine. That's very important because it tells you that you are in equilibrium conditions, and basically what this equation is telling you is that most of the distributions are sampled by these functions, which basically tells you where the bulk of the distribution sits, is in the minimum of energy, right? So I would say that statistical thermodynamics of equilibrium is about the bulk of the equilibrium distributions. But now let's consider what does this imply when I have, say, a barrier in the system. Well, a barrier in the system, like the standard 2 well-buried potential energy surface we discussed last time. A barrier in the system, according to this distribution, will be basically dominated by configurations that sits here. So the distribution with Boltzmann distribution with large here, and will be very exponentially suppressed in the transition region. So when I compute thermal energies, I really don't care of, for instance, what's the shape here of the potential energy, because they will contribute so little to thermal averages that I really don't care. Right? But now let's suppose we are interested in processes different from just in quantities that are not just the thermal averages and equilibrium of observables. For instance, we might be interested in the problem of kinetics. And kinetics is basically a field of statistical physics which is concerned not only timescales but also mechanisms. So, for instance, prototypical example of reactive kinetics is a problem where I have a configuration space which contains several barriers. Let's consider here the simplest case in which I have a barrier. So I have a basin here, which I call the reactant basin. I have a barrier here, which I indicate as a cross. And I have here a product basin. And maybe my barrier here is complicated. It might have like several mountains. You can think about the reactant being Trento, the barrier being Monte Bondone, Monte Paganella, Monte Baldo. And in between the mountains, there could be some saddles right here. And then you might ask, suppose my initial population of states is entirely concentrated in the reactant. How do I start populating the product space? Because of the spontaneous quantum fluctuation, thermal fluctuations of the system. And how does this process through which an initial population gets distributed through the configuration space is basically a thermalization problem. And in particular, how does a distribution that is initially confined in the reactant reaches a well-defined region of configuration space, which is surrounded by an hypersurface, which I call the product, is called reactive kinetics problem. And it's called like that because this is a typical system where structural or chemical reactions take place. What is a reaction? Is something that becomes something else. A goes into B. In this case, R goes into P. And understanding the kinetics and understanding these reactions, it's a multitask question. It involves understanding, first of all, how long does it take? Obviously, on average. And it involves asking, what is the mechanism? What are the mechanisms? And by mechanism, I mean typically in our qualitative example is if I put many particles in the reactant, I have a bunch of mountains and valleys. What are the most important pathways which typical stochastic trajectories follow in order to reach the product? We already mentioned this question when we were discussing the networks, and we were using this question to motivate that networks were fairly good tools to fairly good tools to analyze processes and understand insight into the reaction mechanism. Now we wanted to go deeper into this very fundamental problem for a number of reasons. First of all, because it's relevant for many fields in physics and chemistry. It's of course a chemistry problem because reactions are everywhere in chemistry. Basically, chemistry is a theory about reactions. But it is not restricted to chemistry. It goes over to physics, biology, material science, economics, gambling. Much of these results that make up the knowledge about reactive events are statistical processes invented really by the gambling firm in the last century. Much of the statistical mechanics of stochastic processes was invented to provide a safe and scientific base for the merging of income of gambling houses in Las Vegas and company. Sounds like a joke, but it's not actually. It's quite interesting. Okay, so of course applications are everywhere. How long does a glass take to relax? How long does a protein take to fold? How long does a chemical reaction take to occur? But also, how does thermalizations processes occur in general. What is the concept of mechanism in statistical physics? So there are fundamental questions up there, because you see, the concept of ensemble of configurations just doesn't apply to this, because this is non-equilibrium process. And I want to emphasize this. Reactions are non-equilibrium process. They are non-equilibrium, but when we speak about non-equilibrium, we can think about two ways of determining what is non-equilibrium, at least conceptually. There is a non-equilibrium transient phase, which ultimately leads to an equilibrium condition. For instance, you are putting all your proteins into stretch configuration, either by pulling or by adding chemical denaturant uh, into your system, and then you are watching how all these proteins sort of collapse down into biologically active state by rolling down the energy surface and ultimately going into a product state, which is where most of the equilibrium population is. So in this context, the initial situation is non-equilibrium, but the bath is in equilibrium, and your system, by the zeroth principle of thermodynamics, or by the very structure of stochastic equations of motions, is bound to reach an equilibrium system. Yet you're interested not in the equilibrium phase, but in the transit phase, because, for instance, you want to understand how does a protein make it to the final state, because you want to intervene in that. And I will mention more about that later. But just for those who, legitimately couldn't care less about biophysics in this audience, let me give an example of applications of similar transient physics in a very different context. In subnuclear physics, there is a lot of interest in so-called heavy ion collisions, and heavy ion collisions are used to understand what happens if you heat up matter, strong matter, to a point that you generate a phase transition and you release the quarks from their cage, the hadrons. You deconfine colors. And how do they do that? They take a very heavy atom, nuclei such as gold, for instance, or even single proton, depending on the accelerator, and they smash it head on. By smashing them head on, you can work out the kinetics and discover that you are in a condition of generating a fireball with a huge density of quarks and gluons within the typical size of a hadron. Now, because of the initial kinetic energies delivered into this center, you can, and because the interactions are very strong and fast, the system very rapidly reaches a thermal equilibrium, but then begins to expand. And as it expands, it's cooling down. So if you reach an initial state so hot that the quarks can sort of deconfine from the nuclei, and nucleons and hadrons, well, then the system then reaches and explodes and expands, reaches gradually cools off, and eventually reaches a freeze-out phase. And by the time it reaches the freeze-out phase, quark confinement is back restored. So this is a reaction of going from an initial state in some equilibrium to another state that is in a different equilibrium, and you want to understand the transient. And the transient, by definition, is a non-equilibrium process. So you understand the importance of being able to address non-equilibrium questions and not be limited to to completely equilibrated situations, which are the heart of your standard education in statistical mechanics. And I could go on with examples. So there is, however, another a second class of non-equilibrium process, which are steady non-equilibrium state. By that I mean something that can reach a stationary distribution, but is never a Boltzmann distribution. You might wonder what this could be. Just go on your bathroom and open the water pipe. Well, there will be a transient phase when the first drops of water will pour down your sink. Then after a while, there will be a steady state of flow. And in this system, you're continuously pumping in new particles from a source and taking them out from a sink. So this is never in equilibrium, never reaches a Boltzmann distribution because the velocity is never Maxwellian, just to give an example. You have a constant flow of particles. But this is a steady state non-equilibrium process. So you see, non-equilibrium dynamics is everywhere, and it's any electronic circuits is constantly driven off equilibrium by the batteries, right? So once again, understanding non-equilibrium both in a transient meaning than in a steady state non-equilibrium meaning is a central question. Now, in these lectures, the next two lectures, I will concentrate almost solely on the first class of non-equilibrium phenomena, transient phenomena. And before I dive into that, I'd like to give you an example that concerns our own research that emphasizes how important it is to be able to statistically characterize in a rigorous sense these processes. Our interest, the interest of this example is biophysical. We were interested in the protein folding reactions. So you have a bunch of initial state in which the proteins are generated by the ribosome as linear chains, and ultimately they must all go into a well-specific final state. I don't know, I draw it like that. Where the biological state, that's the native state. Now, this is a prototypical non-equilibrium state. Now, if you can characterize in a rigorous form how this reaction works using the tools of statistical mechanics, then you might be able to intervene biologically and pharmacologically and generate new treatments. And that's exactly what we've been developing and patenting over the last several years. And the paper would be able to finally publish this paper after 2 years held in our drawers because of intellectual property rights of the founding institutions. We'll be able to release this discovery this week, by the way. So what we could do in this case was to predict, and using the tools that we'll be developing in these lectures, we'll be able to predict that the proteins typically fold through an intermediate state and then eventually reach the native state. Now, suppose this protein is involved in a pathology. For instance, it's a protein used by the COVID virus to enter the cell. I'm just giving an example. And then you want to lower the expression of this protein in the cell, maybe not completely kill, but lower so that the virus has more troubles to enter the cell. You want to be able to modulate the expression because maybe if you completely eliminate it, then you have side effects and you die for other reasons. So maybe you just want to lower by 50% the amount of cells, of proteins of this type in the cell. Then our idea, that is based on the results, statistical mechanics results that I will discuss in this lecture, is that if you can have a theoretical, well-defined definition of intermediates and kinetics of intermediates, and you can predict them in some ways using computer simulations, then you can hope to invent small molecules which bind to specific pockets in this state and stop the folding process. And we could do that for a protein that was considered undruggable because we were the only ones that, using pathological methods that I will probably discuss at the end of this course, were able to simulate this process and find this intermediate. So you see, and then we, tested experimentally in cell and discovered that yes, we could actually remove some dangerous protein from the cell and let the cell recover. And I'm giving this side discussion to give you an example of how important it is to be able to formulate rigorously statistical mechanical problems, not only for the sake of remaining within the cultural borders of physics, but also in a wider perspective of applying these concepts in other fields, and in this case, in a particular relevant fields. And just to close this sideways, I'm saying that we are precisely working on the COVID emergency using the same technology by exploiting computers that the Italian Institute for Nuclear Physics is providing for free in order to face. They're trying to stop one of the viral infection agents in a cell, a particular protein called AC2, that is involved in virus penetration into a cell. Right. So, with all this in mind, let's begin discussing what is called transition path theory. So what is transition path theory? Transition path theory is the mathematical framework which you use to describe reactive events which occur in configuration space or phase space. I'm stressing this concept because transition path theory is in its normal implementation and definition does not concern transitions that involve going into a different configuration space, i.e. chemical reactions. You have a bunch of atoms of some sort, and all of a sudden you become other sorts, and then clearly the configuration space is completely new. And then chemical reactions are an entirely different process where your particles change nature during the reaction. And we don't want to do that in these lectures. We consider particle going from one point to the other, particle changing shapes, but nothing that change their own, something that you can describe simply by the Euclidean coordinates and velocities, in other words. And it is surprising that as fundamental as this problem is, it has only been solved, a coherent theory, only emerged, say, about a decade ago. Before that, there was no thoroughly rigorous approach to formulate this problem. And transition path theory is basically how you extend the concept of ensemble, ergodicity, connecting time average with phase space variables in a non-equilibrium setting of reactive events. Okay? So first let's formulate the problem. So let's talk about reactive events. Once again, we have a configuration space, or I will work in configuration space assuming under damped dynamics as our training ground, but everything can be extended to a phase space with any form of dynamics that couples to a heat path, for instance, the standard Langevin dynamics in the underdamped regime. So let's assume that in configuration space I have a region, not necessarily a basin, any region surrounded by a hypersurface in configuration space, omega r, and the region within the hypersurface omega r is called the reactant. Then I will consider another region of configuration space surrounded by another hypersurface, omega p, and I call this reaction product. And then I will make some assumption about the underlying dynamics. I assume the underlying dynamics is going to be microscopically reversible. so that I'm sure that if I wait long enough, I reach equilibrium. And in addition, I will work under the assumptions that the dynamics can be considered Markovian in either configuration space or phase space, depending where I'm working. So basically, Langevin equations, either in the underdamped or overdamped routine by themselves, provide a sufficient theoretical tool to study this problem. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is to provide a definition of reactive process we are interested in and a corresponding ensemble. So since we are in the microscopical regime, the phase space is supposed to be effectively limited. Effectively limited, I mean that there is a temperature and you can only explore a finite volume per portion with finite probability. So basically you can thermalize if you wait long enough. Then I know that conceptually, if I would shoot one very long trajectory, starting from any point, say, for sake of definiteness, starting from the reactant, I would eventually reach ergodicity. Ergodicity means that I visit each point in configuration space many times. Or to be more specific, given a partition of configuration space into cells of arbitrary volume, I will be able to count arbitrarily many trajectories that go through each cell. Whether I will be able to do it or not in practical simulation, that's an entirely different question. For the next couple of lectures, we'll be only theoretically formulating the problem. So let's suppose I have a trajectory and starts here. And let's suppose, for sake of definiteness, it doesn't have to be, it is not an assumption of the theory, it's just for now makes things a little bit easier to think. Let's assume that reactant and basins are both metastable states, in other words, that they're within energy or entropy defined regions, and then you have a barrier between the two so that you can decouple the timescales. Once again, this is not a hard request, it's just something we do it for practice. It makes because eventually that's the kind of problems you want to apply this theory to. So although the theory is slightly more general, it makes no sense to formulate it in an extremely general sense if you're always going to apply to this kind of problems. Right. So let's formulate it directly for the problem we want to. So I have my very long trajectories in the reactant. Occasionally, my trajectory will explore regions outside the reactant, but since there is a barrier, it will then come back. And very so often, some trajectories will exit the reactant and reach the product before touching the reactant. And begin wandering around the reactant. And then again, every so often, there will be other trajectories that will land in the reactant back. And if you keep on doing this, you will become ergodic, but you have at least a way of defining well reactive events. We want a rigorous mathematical definitions of the object of our investigations. The object of our investigations are these red sections of the trajectories. So they are portion of a long ergodic trajectories that leave the reactant and reach the product before going back to the reactant. It's a well-defined question, well-defined concept. So the first step towards characterizing reacting events is providing the concept of ensemble of reactive pathways. So let's define what is called a transition path ensemble. And I want to emphasize that I use the word ensemble because basically everything we are trying to do here, what we are trying to achieve here, is nothing but an extension of Boltzmann-Gibbs ensemble theory to describe dynamics non-equilibrium processes. So, as I'm speaking, I'm going back to the notes, make sure I use the same notation as I did in the notes. I am trying to formulate the problem in a form that is sort of amenable to extend familiar ideas and concepts from statistical mechanics. So how do I rigorously define transition and path ensemble? So given one infinite trajectory, one ergodic trajectory, I can define along the trajectory two observables. T plus, so given the configuration at time t, and given the entire path up to time t, or entire ergodic trajectory up to time t. Well, sorry, let me rephrase, I've been quite inaccurate. Given a path, it goes from, say, t going from 0 all the way to t, so t greater than 0 and t less than some t max. And this is effectively infinite in the sense that it's long enough for being ergodic. Let me, for every t in this interval, I have a position x of t, or a phase space point f of t, depending on whether I'm in configuration space or in phase space. But that's not the only observable I can define. I can define non-local observables in times. What is a non-local observable? It's an observable that does not depend on the instantaneous position or phase space coordinate. It depends on the entire history until some given time, or future and past history. And to be specific, let's consider these two times, t plus of t and t negative of t. So the first time is the smallest time t prime greater than t, such that x of t, let me write it here, prime, belongs to either the reactant or the product. And let me call t minus the largest time t prime less than t, such that x t prime goes into R and the union of reactant and product. So in other words, let's look at what these observables are. Let's put an equal sign here. So if you are in the either in the reactant and in the product, t plus and t minus are the same. So the first observation we want to make is that if x belongs to R union P, then t plus t prime equals T negative T prime equals T prime. Conversely, if x of T prime is actually not in either of the two regions, then T plus of T prime is not T negative of T prime. Well, is this, so one might say, well, then, you know, T plus and T prime can be used to tell me whenever I am on a reactive pathway. Because if I observe that T plus is not equal to T minus, then I'm on the reactive pathways. If T plus is equal to T minus, then I'm not in the reactive pathways, I'm staying either in the reactant or in the product. That's not quite true, because, for instance, remember, I could have reactant, product, and I could have a trajectory that wanders here, leaves this at sometimes T negative, and lands here, and sometimes T plus. But this is not a reactive process. So what is the definition of reactive process, which is the heart of what we want to characterize statistically through transition path theory? Well, an ergodic trajectory is said to be reactive if, no, sorry, it's said to be reactive at some specific time T bar if the following three conditions are simultaneously satisfied. Number one, x of T bar belongs to omega transition, and omega transition is omega modulus omega r, sorry, I used omega to describe hypersurfaces, while in the notes I use omega to describe volume, so that's a bad notation. So if x belongs to, say, does not be, I can write it the following way, does not belong to R union P. To be specific, if let me call V the entire configuration space, then x at T bar belongs to V modulus R union P, which means the complementary region respect to Bayesian reactant and product together. But that's a mathematician's definition. We understand. If you're not neither in the reactant nor in the product. Property number two, x of T negative of T bar belongs to the reactant. So in other words, the particle entered these transition regions by getting out of the reactant. So at time T negative, the last time it was not in the transition time, it was in the reactant. And three, the next time it will be not in the transition region, will be in the product. Now, if you combine this these three properties together, you describe that basically what we are really doing is that a reactive process is one that gets out of the reactant, and the next time it gets either to the reactant and into the product is by entering the product. So we really are defining a productive event. As trivial as all this may seem, is the key for defining in a mathematically rigorous way an ensemble of events upon which you want to define statistical averages. So go back a moment to your statistical mechanics course, and remember the way you start statistical mechanics course is to define an ergodic trajectory and then assume the ergodic hypothesis that you can replace time averages with phase space averages. That's the heart of statistical mechanics, of Gibbs' ensemble concept. Right? Now, the definition we worked here of a reactive path ensembles is basically the key to use the same ideas. All you're doing is that you take your ergodic trajectory, but before you start doing anything, you're gonna chop out, restrict yourself only to the reactive parts of the trajectories and throw into the garbage everything else. So a transition path ensemble is the ensemble you construct from a long ergodic trajectory without making any constraint by adding these three constraints that I listed and selected only the trajectories while they simultaneously satisfy these three conditions. The result is an ensemble of configurations, but also an ensemble of short trajectories. And this is called the reaction path or transition path ensemble. And already by just looking at this very trivial, I mean not trivial, because in the end setting up the problem right is the key to solving the problem. It took 100 years to set up the problem right, from Boltzmann to basically Van Nuyden. Eric Van Nuyden is not very much older than me. He's probably 10 years older than me, and was my age when he, or slightly younger even, when he basically provided all these theories from a mathematics department in University of New York, NYU. So everything that I'm saying is just really just being settled up as a statistical mechanics theory, just a decade ago. And I don't think it is even on textbooks. It's just on lectures. Yet it's a fundamental problem, right? It's a natural extension of Boltzmann statistical theory. So even with this very simple concept of transition path ensemble, we can already give a formal statistical mathematical definitions of what is the reaction rate. And the chemists, almost everything they care is the rate, because they want reactions to be effective or to be ineffective. You know, if you can catalyze a reaction that is important, then you make a lot of money in an industry. If you can stop a reaction that is dangerous, you also make a lot of money. Or vice versa, if you want to build bombs, chemical bombs, but that's another story. Okay, so the rate of reaction K from R to P is actually, you take a longer ergodic trajectory of time extent, the capital T, and then you count how many transition pathways there are per unit time. While in the limit where the length of the ergodic trajectory goes to infinity, you have a statistically large number of events, and your arithmetic average becomes the average of the distribution because of central limit theorem. So that's how you formally define the rate of reactions. Okay, sounds good and fairly simple. And remember when we discussed how you build a Markov state model? That's basically what you do, right? You sit in your state I, you have state J, you're interested in Kij, actually Kji, because the way you label in the rates is from reactant to product. In the indices, I mean. The first index refers to the reactant, and the second to the product, and the second index refers to the reactant. So what you do, you sit in J, and then you say, and you perform many trajectories, and then you start to estimate how long does it take to reach I on average. And that's basically what you're doing. You can either perform a very long trajectory and count, or if you're Markovian, you can start many independent trajectories here and see the first approaches. I say if you're Markovian because if you're Markovian, then clearly you can forget about the past. Markovian particles are lucky entities because they don't have remorse. Whatever is gone is gone. They only think about the future. Okay, so we have so far solved the first question, how to define an ensemble to describe the processes we want to study. Of course, with just ensemble, you do nothing. In the next lecture, we will address the question of what is the equivalent to the Boltzmann distributions for reactive events. So remember, statistical mechanics works because you can go from time averages to phase space averages. That's what Gibbs and Boltzmann big step forward was. You don't need to look at time averages. You can look at ensembles and define phase space averages. That's the heart of statistical physics. Without a phase space, there is no statistical mechanics. Now, everything we have done so far is in time representation, at time of exiting, time of product. So I'm still in the part of the theory where I'm setting up the stage. But in order for the theory for reactive processes to become useful, we need to make the next step. We need to introduce stochastic descriptors which are defining phase space or configuration space and contains all of the information about reactive processes. Now, this is more subtle, if you think about it, than the counterpart in equilibrium statistical mechanics, because if I'm dealing with the equilibrium, there is no time variable in thermodynamics. Because I'm in equilibrium and in the stationary solution of the Fokker-Planck equation, nothing changes with time anymore. So it is quite natural to think that if you are in that setting, then clearly you can remove time and go into phase space. And I'm sure that somehow Boltzmann thought that way, and Gibbs thought that way. Time is redundant. You don't really need it if I'm dealing with equilibrium. But here we're not dealing with equilibrium, we're dealing with transient. Yet, we try to do the same. Define time-independent stochastic descriptors that plays the role of the Boltzmann distribution for equilibrium, which instead characterize reactive events. And since reactive events are intrinsically more complicated than transition, than equilibrium processes, it will not be sufficient to have one stochastic descriptor, the Boltzmann distribution. We will need more. And we will discover that we will need instead 5 stochastic descriptions. Or if you want, a 4-vector of stochastic descriptor and a probability. And I will define this object in the next lecture. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll post the next lecture hopefully very soon.